What's going on, Summoners? My name is Kangas, and I'm here to tell you about all the upcoming changes this next patch. You're in luck because we already have a pretty good idea about most of the changes, and we'll cover them all in this video. Remember that these changes can be pulled before the next patch, but chances are that most of them will make it through. So let's run through what's happening on patch 11.2. First up are the cosmetics. With Viego being released, we expect to see not only his base skin, but also Lunar Beast Viego as his extra skin. As the Ruined King joins the battle, we've also got some new lore-based skins being released as well. Ruined Draven, Karma, and Shyvana will also be made available next patch. We've also got one more skin line coming up, and that is the Shanghai Scrolls line, which will add a more traditional Eastern twist to the following champions: Cho'Gath, Jhin, Nautilus, and Neeko. That covered, it's time to run through these systems changes. Now that preseason is over and the majority of players have made their return, it's obvious that we need to see some more balanced changes. And we'll start with upcoming item nerfs. Our first nerf to cover is the Hextech Rocket Belt. It's still proving to be too powerful of an item. Previously nerfed for its excessive burst damage, we've got more balance changes coming next patch. We expect the movement speed bonus to be decreased from 50% for 2 seconds to 30% for 1.5 seconds instead. Hitting the damage anymore could potentially make the item unable to serve its purpose, and therefore we gotta hit the utility instead. Up next for nerfs is Gale Force. Following some massive buffs, Gale Force has gained, of course, massive popularity. Unfortunately, the nerf Riot planned is that they're reverting the cooldown buff that they gave it, so it's going back down to 90 seconds. This makes me wonder if the item was just undervalued before, and that's why they're thinking, okay, let's just go back to the original one, because that buff was pretty big. As a support main, I'm kinda disappointed by this change because I love laning with 80 carries to build this item, but let's give it a patch and see how things go before coming to any final conclusions. I also want you guys to know that if you're trying to start the season off strong, we're currently offering 20% off of annual subscriptions on ProGuides until the 14th, so you don't want to miss out on this. Check out the description below for a link. Next up, let's talk about my favorite item, Imperial Mandate. Man, where do I even begin with this one? This item has changed the support role completely. And surprisingly, the damage isn't actually being touched, and instead it's just getting a quality of life nerf. Sounds weird to say that, but basically, it's going to be a bit more challenging to use. Rather than applying its per target cooldown off of its activation, it now starts the moment you apply crowd control onto the target. In other words, if you tag an enemy with crowd control but an ally doesn't activate it, you still get locked out of applying it to that same target. This will especially be a nerf to non-supports that use this item, as their damage output will be reduced significantly because of it. But as long as I can keep slapping people with Bard, I'm happy. Finally, Kraken Slayer is receiving a well-needed nerf and will now have reduced damage on certain on-hit modifiers like Katarina's ultimate, Urgot's W, and Aphelios' Q Onslaught. That one's pretty simple, so moving forward, let's talk about item buffs. Tank items are getting some big changes next patch, notably the tank mythics. First up is Turbo CHEMTANK. The cost will be reduced from 3,200 down to 2,800. And will now build out of a Null Magic Mantle instead of a Negatron Cloak. Its ability haste is being increased by 5, MR reduced by 25, and the Mythic passive will now provide ability haste rather than tenacity and slow resist. While it'll provide less defensive stats, it's 400 gold cheaper, and you should be able to purchase it much faster and then spend that saved money specifically on whatever defensive stat that you need. This change will make it a much stronger purchase on the majority of tanks, aside from Singed. Ability haste is going to be superior in most cases, and very few champions would prefer the tenacity and slow resist to that. Engaging should be a lot easier for many tanks with this item, since it's a bit cheaper, and I'd expect this item to quickly gain popularity. Especially looking at all the new support builds that rush Swifties into Dead Man's Plate, this is probably the mythic you're gonna go these days. FROSTFIRE Gauntlet, meanwhile, has gotten a similar treatment. The cost is also being reduced to 2,800, will now build out of cloth armor instead of chain vest, its ability haste increased from 15 to 20, and the armor reduced from 50 down to 25. So far, we've been talking a lot about mythic items, and that makes me think about our question of the day. Which mythic item do you think needs buffs or nerfs? While these changes look nice, I still think the FROSTFIRE Gauntlet will underperform, and obviously it's not doing so hot on the current patch with how powerful Sunfire Aegis is. There's just not that much need to build it. Let me know your answers in the comments below. Now back to item buffs. Next is a buff to Gargoyle's Stoneplate. It'll have its bonus resistance's passive increased from 3% to 5%. That means it'll cap out at a total of 25%. That's 10% more than before, and it'll be a much stronger defensive purchase for champions looking for extra durability. Next up, we've got a change for Essence Reaver. Instead of restoring 3% max mana, it'll now restore 40% of your base AD plus 16% of your bonus AD. This will be a pretty big buff for many champions, and running out of mana is probably going to be something that you'll never need to worry about again. And I know the real question on your mind is, does this make Sivir viable again? And I doubt it. Finally, we've got item adjustments to talk about. Sunfire Aegis is receiving a change, which is to be expected since Turbo CHEMTANK had its mythic stat changed as well. They've swapped, and Sunfire Aegis will now be the item that provides tenacity and slow resist. Before, Sunfire Aegis gave you everything you could want. A good mix of defensive stats, incredible damage, and even ability haste. Now that it provides tenacity and slow resist, it'll be less appealing of a purchase, but still be the choice for players who just want to get into the mix and burn their enemies to death. Phantom Dancer and Runaan's Hurricane are also due for a couple of changes. The cost is being increased from 2,500 up to 2,600, and the attack speed from 40 to 45% for both items. Honestly, this one's a pretty minor nerf, as it'll take a little longer to purchase the items. But if you do manage to make it to the late game, it's an obvious buff, and you'll have slightly more attack speed than before, but we're gonna have to wait and see what the stats say to actually have a strong opinion on that one. Umbral Glaive is also receiving a slight adjustment. The cost is being lowered from 2,800 down to 2,600, the AD from 55 to 50, and will now build out of 2 longswords instead of a Caulfield's Warhammer. Now cheaper, assassins or champions utilizing the lethality builds should be able to finish this item faster and hit mid-game power spikes when they matter the most. The loss of 5 AD will hurt a bit later into the game, but you're usually not trying to let the games go that long with these sort of builds anyway. And personally, I'm excited to try this out on Pantheon support again, because it sucked before. Serpent's Fang is also receiving a similar set of changes, as its cost is being reduced to 2,600 and its AD lowered by 5 as well. Next up, CHEMTANK Chainsword is also receiving a slight adjustment. Its cost will be reduced from 2,700 down to 2,600 and its health lowered from 200 to 150. We've given up some stats for lowered prices, which should help players who focus on the early game snowballing and punish them harder if they let the games drag on for too long. Finally, Shurelya's Battle Song is also getting an adjustment. The health is being lowered from 350 to 200, movement speed removed and replaced with 40 AP, and its base mana regen increased from 50% to 100%. It'll also now build out of Kindle Gem and Bandle Glass Mirror. Ultimately, this will make the item much more appealing to enchanters than it was before, and kind of feels more like the old Shurelya's item. And finally, there's also one rune change to talk about as well. Ravenous Hunter will receive a small nerf because currently it's just too good. Anyone can run it to easily access some healing, and thus the Omnivamp per stack will be reduced from 2% to 1.7%. Next up, let's talk about champion changes. Speaking of healing, it's no surprise that Aatrox is getting some changes up in the top lane. Now, his E will be changed to become stronger during his ultimate. The healing will be increased to 25 to 45% based on ability level, but in compensation, his R's healing amplification is being reduced from 50 to 100% down to 30 to 60%. Basically what this means is that Aatrox's healing from his E specifically will actually be a little bit stronger than before. However, healing from other sources, even Gore Drinker, will take a massive hit during his ultimate following the huge change. This change alone might just be enough to push him out of competitive viability, but we'll see. Next for the top lane is a nerf to Darius. This is a nerf that actually has some substance to it, and I think a lot of top laners are finally able to breathe a sigh of relief knowing that it will do something to him. Darius's passive bonus AD is being decreased from 30 to 230 down to 20 to 205. This should make it so much less punishing in the early game when Darius does manage to stack up his passive all the way. 10 AD lost is huge, and even in the late game you can absolutely notice a loss of 25, especially considering that his ultimate deals true damage. That's it for top laners, so let's look at junglers next. In the jungle, we'll start by mentioning a nerf to Olaf. Again, healing has been a bit too crazy on these patches, especially with the addition of Gore Drinker to the game. Olaf's W lifesteal is being increased from 14 to 22% up to 16 to 24%, but his W healing amplification is being reduced from 0 to 50 down to 0 to 33% based on missing health. Again, this means more healing from his W itself, but less from external sources. Another champion receiving a nerf is Nunu. His movement speed is being lowered by 5 and his base HP lowered from 580 to 540. These are actually pretty harsh nerfs, and I'd expect that especially in high elo, we can expect Nunu's win rate to drop a bit. Squishier and also easier to catch than before, counterpicking Nunu should be a much stronger option than before, and overall his clear speed will be affected. He might even need to back more often, so this is pretty big. Finally, Elise is receiving a nerf to her spider form Q. The damage is being reduced from 70 to 230 down to 70 to 210. Pretty straightforward nerf. Elise's mid and late game are going to be a bit weaker than before. Now for buffs. Let's start with Dr. Mundo. His Q HP refund on hit will be increased from 40 to 50% and refund on kill from 80 to 100%. His ease cost is being reduced from 25 to 65 to 20 to 60. The damage on it increased from 3 to 5% to 4 to 6% max HP, and R healing increased from 50 to 100 to 50 to 110% max HP. Overall, these changes make Mundo a much safer pick than before, and also increases the damage quite a bit, as he'll usually build a ton of health anyway. Trundle is also receiving a buff, as his Q bonus damage ratio is being increased from 10 to 50% to 15 to 55% total AD. Meanwhile, his W's attack speed is going up from 20 to 100 to 30 to 110%. Given how oppressive tanks can be sometimes, it's nice that the counterpick Trundle is getting a buff to keep them in check. Another champion who apparently has been underperforming and doesn't need a buff is Shaco. His passive backstab damage is being increased from 10 to 25 to 20 to 35. On first glance, this might not seem like a big deal, but 10 extra damage in the early game is quite significant. In the late game, it's still an okay buff because this bonus damage can crit. Given how quickly Shaco can snowball in games where he does pull ahead, I'd say that this is a medium-sized buff for Shaco. Will it make him broken? I think he already was, but our analysts say probably not. But he'll definitely be noticeably stronger, and I wouldn't underestimate his upcoming change. You've been warned. Meanwhile, Nocturne is also getting some love. His Q's cooldown is being reduced from 10 to 8 seconds, while his R's cooldown is being lowered from 150 to 100 down to 140 to 90 seconds. 2 seconds off his Q and 10 seconds off of his ultimate are very nice buffs and should help compensate for that transition from cooldown reduction to ability haste that happened this season. Next, let's run through the mid lane. Akali has been a pretty prominent ban for every elo, and she's finally getting a nerf to address this. Akali's Q energy cost is being increased from 120 to 80 to 120 to 100, meaning that she'll have to utilize her passive much more effectively if her plan is to spam abilities as much as possible. In the late game, this means that she'll have to expose herself to danger more frequently to continue dealing the amount of damage that we're used to seeing her deal. LeBlanc is next in the mid lane, and she's actually getting a buff. Her health per level is going up from 92 to 97, while her Q's mana cost is being reduced from 50 to 90 to 50 to 70. These aren't huge, but they'll help out you bushy players nonetheless. Azir is also getting a little buff to help him out. He's been in a much worse spot than LeBlanc with all the assassins present in the mid lane, something that he does not like to see. A little less safe than her, Azir typically needs some more time to scale up and become relevant. His Q's cooldown are being lowered from 15 to 7 to 14 to 6 seconds, which will definitely help out both his early game and his late game. A 6-second cooldown in the late game is incredible, and if you do manage to hit that point, you should be in a pretty good spot to carry as Azir. But with how fast games are right now, I would still advise banking on it. But if you do want to play Azir, go check out ProGuides.com. This guy's insane to learn, very high mechanical skill cap, so our coaches can help you out with all the tips and tricks. Trust me, it's worth it. That's actually it for the mid lane, but we've got tons of bot lane and support changes to go over next. So we'll kick off the bot lane with buffs because that's all that we've got coming for this role actually. Caitlyn's AD per level will be increased from 2.88 to 3.3 next patch. Surprisingly, Caitlyn has been underperforming, and this buff should help her keep up with the competition in the mid to late game. Buffing her early game wouldn't fix much as she'd just become ridiculously oppressive like before, so I actually kinda like this approach by Riot. After all, the mid game is typically where Caitlyn struggles a bit, and having some more AD should help her stay relevant. Another champion who's been absolutely begging for buffs is Varus. And thankfully he's got some more coming this patch. His mana per level is being increased from 33 to 40, while his R's cooldown reduced from 120 to 60 to 100 to 60. Obviously the mana buff is nice, but 20 seconds off of his level 1 ultimate is a giant buff, and it should give Varus players much more playmaking potential. This makes it so much more forgiving to whiff his ult, and even if your aim is perfect, you'll be able to aggressively cast it more frequently, and therefore get much more out of it. Varus might just turn into a dragon control focused bot laner. Finally, we'll talk about Senna as we transition into our supports, as we typically see her flexed into either bot lane or support roles. Senna has been underperforming heavily this season, and she's about to receive some big buffs. I'd watch out because she's getting a lot to help her out. Her attack speed ratio has been increased from 0.2 to 0.3, her non-kill ghoul spawn chance increased from 22 to 28%, gold from ghouls increased from 3 to 8, and her Q's healing ratios increased from 40% AD and 25% AP to 50% AD and 40% AP. Both support and carry Sennas are getting a lot out of these changes. There's more gold, more damage, and overall much better scaling. With all these changes, our analysts are definitely going to keep an eye on her to see how well she performs next patch. Specifically in the support role, those ghoul changes are going to be felt. Now we'll talk about the dedicated supports. Starting with the big old tree that's managed to find itself in the bot lane once again and get me a little free LP along the way. Maokai, for lack of better words, has just been an insanely good support pick since the new items were introduced into the game. To compensate for this, his E mana cost is going up next patch from 60 to 80 to 60 to 100, and the AP ratio lowered from 1% per 100 AP to 0.8% per 100 AP. This actually leaves Tank Maokai in the top lane practically untouched, as they usually don't build AP to begin with. If you want to go and try and prove me wrong, go for it, but note that building AP will be noticeably weaker next patch. While it'll remain viable, it's pretty clear that support Maokai was targeted specifically by this change. This doesn't necessarily affect his early game supporting though, so I think he's still going to be pretty oppressive. And yes, I will continue abusing him. Bite me. Soraka is the last champion to talk about, and she's getting big buffs to her Q and W. First, Q's health restore is being increased from 50 to 90 to 50 to 110, while her W's heal is going up from 80 to 220 plus 60% AP to 90 to 230 plus 70% AP. Maybe this is also part of why Battlesong got those changes. Now, building some AP in Soraka's build will be really rewarding, as a 70% ratio on her W is actually really generous. Hell, maybe even a Mejai's Soul Stealer while duoing with a buddy might not be such a bad idea after this change. It's been really rough for Soraka, as engaged supports that can one-shot you have pretty much been the norm so far. You don't really get a chance to heal back up if you're getting 100 to 0'd in every fight after all. So we'll see if this moves the mark at all. And that'll wrap it up for upcoming changes for patch 11.2. Thanks so much for watching the video, we always appreciate the support, and if you want to support us even more, sub to the channel and also check out the description in the link below if you're interested in joining our Discord. We're gonna have all kinds of information you can find about a giveaway that we're currently running, so make sure to check it out. Until next time though, best of luck on Summoner's Rift.